Hi, I'm Arthur Haines, and today we're going to be looking at a very efficient method of collecting food from the cattail. We're here in a marsh today, and we're specifically going to be interacting with broad-leaved cattail, which is Typha latifolia. Now, the knowledge of cattail as a food, in particular the part that we're examining today, comes from around the world. A documented pollen collection from Asia, South America, North America, Polynesia. Interestingly, we seem to have little evidence that cattail, this particular portion, was gathered as a food in Europe, though it's very likely that the indigenous there also utilized it. So as I've alluded to, we're going to be looking at the pollen. Now, unfortunately, many of us read in foraging books where it is the actual pollen that is gathered by shaking it into a bag or into a container of some kind. And anyone who's done this will know that it takes a lot of work to gather a very small amount of food. So I'm drawing on knowledge of the South American continent natives, in particular the people from the Gran Chaco area of Paraguay and Argentina, who gathered what they referred to as totoro, which is the cattail. And what they did was they actually utilized the entire flower from the pollen-bearing portion, rather than simply gathering just the pollen itself. And as you'll see, it's an easy and effective way to gather a lot of food extremely quickly. So I'm going to show you a few different stages of cattail today and how I prefer to collect this. This is especially important given that few of us have abundant time to make our forays into the wild for foraging. Okay, here we're looking at the reproductive portion of the cattail. And you'll notice that its spike has two portions. This lower portion is what we would call the ovule-bearing portion. This is the part that will ultimately fruit, have a seed, and it turns brown, and is the part that many people are familiar with because it persists on the plant into the fall and through the winter. The upper portion is the pollen-bearing portion, and these are the staminate flowers that shed pollen to the wind. Now, this particular portion that you notice on this plant is actually beginning to turn a bit brown, and if I tap this, you'll notice I get maybe just a little hint of pollen, but actually most of it has been shed. So this particular individual is a bit late for collecting food. Now, here is an individual that's at an appropriate stage for gathering the free-flowing pollen. And you'll notice if I actually tap this individual, you can see that pollen being shed to the wind, and in fact you can see the yellow dust on my hand. Unfortunately, the pollen occupies such a tiny little portion of this upper portion of the spike that there's very little food to be gathered, even when this plant is at its peak for releasing pollen. I really don't spend any time with this particular stage because I've learned a much faster way, again by relying on the indigenous knowledge of other continents, a much quicker way to gather food, and that's what I'm going to show you next. What I've done is I've gathered the top part of the cattail so I can show you more easily the collecting process. This is the inflorescence, this being the part that will turn brown later in the season and bear the fruits. This is the part that's going to be shedding pollen just a couple of days from now. And what I want you to notice about this is that rather than being a perfectly smooth green cylinder, it's getting a bit lumpy, for lack of a better word. That perfect smooth silhouette is being broken, and there's also some yellow tinging going on. And that's the pollen-bearing flowers ready to expand and shed their pollen. What I want to do is I want to gather this now in its entirety, rather than waiting until the pollen is to be shed to the wind, because it's very difficult to gather it in quantity. So all I'm going to do is use my thumb and forefinger, and I'm simply going to strip these flowers off, and you can see I get this large mass of flowers which contain the pollen, as well as the pollen sacs, the filament that supports them, and a few other miscellaneous flowering parts. So I add some fiber to this, but I get all of the nutrition that's provided in the pollen because it's contained within these flowers. Now here's a mason jar, just so I can show you what I've gathered. This is the material that I've gathered from 6 plants. I'm certainly not done collecting and have a ways to go to fill this container. But can you imagine, for those of you who have gathered strictly the pollen before by shaking it into a container, how little you would have after 6 plants. I'm actually a quarter the way full of a quart-sized jar after just a very, very short time. In fact, it's taken only a minute to gather this much. Now, of course, you don't have to strip the pollen-bearing flowers off from the axis of this inflorescence. You can simply leave them on. Another way of gathering the pollen-bearing flowers as food is to simply break this at the junction between the fruit-bearing flowers and the pollen-bearing flowers. This part offers very little food, whereas this part is absolutely wonderful. And I can simply drop this into a pot of boiling water for just 2 or 3 minutes. I can steam it for that length of time, and the odor that emanates from this will remind you very much of corn, except you're getting a non-genetically modified food with all of the inherent richness that goes along with wild foods. So in terms of nutrition, what is in the cattail? Well, in terms of macronutrients, they're all found. Proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Though the lipid portion is very small compared to the amino acid content and to the carbohydrate content. Minerals, calcium and iron, are the real standouts here, though others are found as well: phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. When it comes to vitamins, cattail pollen is very richly endowed with vitamin C. In fact, it has 4 times the content of oranges in terms of ascorbic acid. But what's really interesting is that researchers found that the dried pollen, and this was one of the common ways that the natives of South America would store the pollen for later use, the dried pollen after 6 months still had a high vitamin C content. So this alludes to the presence of antioxidants that are protecting the vitamin C from degradation, though that was not something that was specifically sought for by the researchers. So in closing, I'd like to say get out and enjoy the cattail, and I give thanks to my South American indigenous friends who very indirectly have shown me a super efficient way of gathering this so that I can consume it raw and cooked into things like breads, soups, stews, and other such items. It's an absolute wonderful food, and I do hope that you get a chance to sample it this year.